I get asked a lot. One of the questions I get asked a lot is kind of, I think, the question that you already alluded to, Joost. Is this a hype or not? As I always say to my students, if I ask you a question at the exam, if you want to get a sufficient grade, then each answer has to start with "it depends." So it depends how you look at it. But I think overall, it's good to start by taking a historical perspective and just ask, why do we see these new organizational forms emerge at this point in time? And I think you already mentioned it, speedy innovation. We need to innovate faster. It is an important reason why organizations are looking at something different than the traditional hierarchy, because the hierarchy is notoriously bad at innovating and certainly at innovating fast. I think another movement behind it is that we move away from the shareholder value view more to the shared value or the stakeholder view or the purpose of the company. And that also means that the wisdom of how to manage a company cannot reside only by the man in top or the woman in top, the CEO. You need more diverse perspectives to deal with difficult trade-offs between financials and the environment, for example. That's difficult to do, and to get everybody involved in that and to get all perspectives, everybody contributing to the debate, self-organization works better than hierarchy. The most important factor, I think, in why we see these new organizational forms is actually IT. IT kind of forces us to do other things, but it also enables self-organization. Because in self-organization, teams or individuals need to take their own decisions. And you can only do that when you have the information at hand and the decision-making tools at hand to make those decisions. And IT really provides that. And I think that's a bit of an underrated element in many management books that write about self-organization. That the entire idea that technology also helps us further in doing this is really very important. So in that sense, I would say overall, I don't think this is a hype. There's good logic why these things are happening at this point in time. At the same time, it's not for everybody. And that is sometimes, I think, where the hype starts. And that is when organizations start to apply it at really either aren't ready, which is something we can deal with, but also when really self-organization does not apply. And one of the reasons, or one of the places where it might not apply, is actually where the consequences of self-organization can be disastrous. To give a very simple example, imagine you get into the plane and the crew comes in and it's a self-organizing team, and you hear the crew say, "Okay, guys, who wants to try to fly the plane today?" That's not a position where you want to have self-organization. And the same in emergency rooms in hospitals. Now you want to have processes, procedures, checklists, and some hierarchy. And I see that there's quite a lot of experimentation with new organizational forms by all kinds of companies that really haven't thought through whether it's right for them at all, or whether it's right for their people. The second point that, whether it's right for their people, I think more has to do with an implementation kind of thing. And that is sometimes why the hype does come in, that organizations just try to implement it one day to the next. They say, okay, from now on, you're all self-organizing and good luck, without really thinking through what kind of conditions need to be fulfilled to make self-organization necessary. And just to share just one brief thing, I will not go through it in detail, but that's one element of the book that we have is what are conditions for self-management or self-organization. And we list 14 of them in the book. And I find also working with my consulting clients that this is a list that really sobers them up. It really gets them thinking, okay, are we ready for this? Because maybe we can use it in our organization, but maybe our IT is not okay. Maybe our people just aren't ready. Maybe the managers are just too much in control mode. And just go through all these conditions, and some of them are even pretty complex, I think helps also in taking the hype out of the discussion and yeah, making it more realistic what we're talking about. So I think also a lot goes wrong in implementation. The question is, are you ready? And when you're ready, then how are you going to implement it? And that maybe is my final point. I see some managers who want to be very heroic and they say, okay, we do it in one big bang approach. And that all looks very, looks great, and it shows that they're daring individuals, etc. But maybe that's not for all. I mean, there are companies that have done it that way. I think ING took a big bang approach, but only after a very long preparation period. And other companies may fare much better with having a more gradual implementation. But there always is in managers this difficulty of saying, yeah, can we have two types of organization structures at the same time in our organization? They don't tend to like it. They think it's maybe messy. But actually, quite a lot of implementation that I've seen are very successful with that. So make a more gradual approach to implementing it would also be one of my tips to, get rid of the hype feeling and make it more realistic.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this initial statement. Joost, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, so thank you, Ard-Pieter. That's something I think to discuss some things later. What I would like to start with is like more of a definition kind of thing, like what are we actually talking about? Because we heard things like self-organization, holacracy, maybe some self-managing organizations. This is all, I think there's many different definitions and many people are using, I think, different words for maybe the same thing or maybe something else. My interest comes a little bit from another angle, like Joost already told very nicely in his introduction. We started off by visiting many different companies around the world, and what we call pioneering companies. So that is also not really a good definition, I would say, but we came from the interest of not necessarily self-organizing, but from the interest of, okay, which companies are, I would say, famous in the future of work debate for having engaged employees. So which companies are actually good in engaging their workforce or having a motivated kind of character in their model or in their way of organizing. And over the last 5 years, we have visited, I would say, around 100 of these workplaces around the globe. So not just in Western Europe and also not just in Silicon Valley, but we try to go to many different pockets of the world and many different industries. And what was like a current theme in many of these organizations is that they had indeed high engagement by employees, but most of them also had a lack of formal middle management. So I would like, if we go on in this debate, if I talk about self-organizing or self-organized organization or self-managed organization, then I mean a company without formal middle management positions. So rather like a company that is built up by teams or individuals, that still has like a top leadership team on top, but the like traditional like middle layer has disappeared and often indeed replaced by an IT solution or like an IT coordination system. Like you can imagine this kind of organizations, and many of these organizations actually start. If you start a startup or you start like a sporting team or like small scale organizing, you actually start like that. You don't start with middle management directly by assigning a manager to, for example, manage your soccer team or your startup of 4 or 5 people. Like I think this kind of middle management ideas we see appear when maybe companies become like 50 people or 100 people or maybe larger. So I'm in particular interested in large scale organizations, let's think 1,000 or 10,000 people that still operate without formal middle management. And there are actually a few in the world that are able to do that or that show that they can do that, which are I think we cannot even count them on two hands. So that's really like a small club of organizing, like pioneering this kind of models. But from those models or from those companies, I would like to share like three broad observations. The first observation is like this kind of organizations are not bound by cultures. So it's not that we find this kind of organizations only in the West or only in Silicon Valley. We actually found very interesting examples of them in emerging cultures like China, Russia, and India, which is kind of interesting if you think about more the kind of power dynamics that are like at least at play in some of those cultures. The second observation is that this kind of organizations are not bound to certain industries, which I mean, many people would think this would work only in IT or like in knowledge worker environments. We actually found quite some interesting examples in manufacturing, in production, and in things like retail. And the third observation I would like to highlight, which might be even the most important one, is that self-organization is not anarchy. It's not that people just can do things and they can decide everything for themselves. I would like argue rather the opposite. It's actually very structured. In many of these organizations, there's a very clear frameworks. There are very clear rules. These kind of organizations, I think, are defined by things like radical transparency, that performance metrics are open for everybody to see. There is a high degree of models, like modularity, like the organization can be built up of different building blocks. There's high levels of maybe not top-down control, but a lot of peer control, like you're very much controlled by your peers and by your teammates. There's maybe not high degrees of managers, but there's a high degree of local leadership. So there's a strong leadership cultures. And there's like things like self-initiative. If you don't take initiative in those organizations, there is big chance that you will not succeed. So yeah, I think this was like three, I think, important points that I think are big misconceptions about this way of organizing.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for these. For these initial statements. There are already some questions I'd like to ask. So the first one is in this, these new self-managing organizations. So Joost, if I remember that correctly, you said basically in some of these forms, at least middle management is actually disappearing.
It's not like the formal middle management position doesn't exist. So there is a top management position, and then there is often like teams, like autonomous teams, like underneath the top management. And of those, there is no person in that team that has more authority over the others. So there's always a select group of like 2, 3, 4, 5 people that are top management. They have authority, formal authority over the other people in the organization. But beyond those, there is none.
But here my question about, you mentioned the point about formal authority. Yeah. Are we maybe just replacing in self-managing organizations managerial authority with peer authority?
Yeah, or you can frame it differently. Are we maybe replacing a natural hierarchy or artificial hierarchy by a natural hierarchy? I think that is more the case.
Okay. Yeah. I see your. Yeah. Okay. I see your point.
So I think there's like hierarchy. I think is an interesting concept. I think there's always hierarchy in groups, and I think many organizations try to or have a mismatch with, I think in academics you would call that the formal and the informal organization, which basically I think comes down to like what is a natural hierarchy and what is the artificial hierarchy. And I think, I'm quite convinced that many of these large-scale self-managing organizations are driven by some kind of natural hierarchical processes in the teams. So you will see leaders and you will see people having more informal, maybe expertise, there's like a hierarchy of expertise, there's a hierarchy of like influence, So yeah, for sure, those dynamics are still at play. It's not that it's like completely equal.
I think both Ard-Pieter and Joost, you mentioned that we can observe self-managing organizations in all types of industries. So, and one of the questions from the audience is, do these organizations, although they are in different industries, maybe of different size, do they share some kind of a similar DNA or a similar way of thinking, which is basically required for a in order to be a successful self-managing organization? Peter, what's your point on
Yeah,
this?
I think it's always difficult. I mean, what do you understand with DNA? Huh? And I think there are some red lines we can get out of these cases, I think a couple of them. That it's a complex question that maybe requires more than 45 minutes. But I think there are a couple of things that you can see that's really important. I mean, often there's really a very clear vision about what they want to do and where they want to head and where they want to go to. And that sounds like basically an open door. But actually, if you look at many traditional organizations, it's really not that clear, and certainly not on the working floor, let's say, where the organization's heading and why the organization is there. What I see with those organizations that use the new models, I think the vision of what the company is for is much more internalized at different layers of the organization than in the traditional hierarchy, where a lot of that gets lost in translation. There may be a beautiful vision on the C-level, but already the level down understands half of it, let alone 6 levels beneath that. I think there are also quite some behavioral things. So different roles of management. Management that is still there, top management, or even if it is middle management, if we have less extreme definition than Joost uses, their role is also much more facilitating and coaching, feedback type of things, rather than directive and controlling. And I think that's also in the part of that DNA, that there is a certain trust in that people can make their own decisions, provided that all the other guidelines that Joost also mentioned are in place. It's not just freedom for everybody. So I see a couple of those things I think are relevant in the DNA of those organizations. At the same time, how the models are implemented is vastly different, because if we talk at the Spotify model as implemented in Spotify or even ING, we talk about something completely different than the Holacracy model, or even the Rendan Hei higher example that is now so popular and that we see in China. So there's still a lot of diversity there as well, but I think a common denominator is more or less along those lines.
Joost?
So if I take examples like the large scale examples like Buurtzorg in Holland and Haier in China, or Vuxville in Russia, which is a large retail organization in Russia, or Jaipur Works, which is like a manufacturer of works with 40,000 weavers. What I think what is the common thread or the DNA is that there is often a leadership team that really believes that organizing through hierarchy and bureaucracy is maybe not anymore the smartest thing to do in 2020. So they start to question themselves, like, how can we put the front line of the people that are closest to the customer, that actually in the front line, how can we like engage them the most in the work they do? And many of the times the answer is not hierarchy, and the answer is also not bureaucracy. So they come up and I think Art already said that in his introduction, they come up with enablers like IT solutions to communicate and to coordinate the work that we normally, or like that normally is always done through middle management. So there is this, I think, of a belief that the human is actually wants to work, or it goes all back, I think, to Douglas McGregor, Theory X to Theory I. Like those leaders believe that people actually want to work, that they want to do a good job and not a bad job, that you don't necessarily have to control them, but that you need to give them the tools to actually excel. And then they create this kind of organization around it. I think there is actually two important differences that we observe, and that's, or that we can observe. And that's when you have an organization that has tasks that are really interdependent of each other. Like think about like a complex manufacturing firm like Haier. That's completely different than like a healthcare organization like Buurtzorg in Holland, which is very much, it's very easy to actually cut down that organization in 1,000 teams, because all the teams do the same thing basically. In an organization like Haier, or in a retail organization that needs to have like a long supply chain, that becomes completely different. So in those organizations, you will see not necessarily only IT solutions, but also more of a kind of a market solutions, like by the implementing of contracts between teams or with individuals with the firm, which I think many of us are not really used to have like a contract with another team on deliverables, for example. So there are some like clever, I think, solutions. Also goes into platform thinking and ecosystem thinking as well. So there is some much more advanced, I think, thinking behind it that many people will see, and like, or what actually you will see or think on your first like observation.
Thanks. So some of the some of the questions here in the chat deal with the role of employees, and especially the question, what are the, let's say, requirements from the employee perspective? So if you want to introduce a self-managing organization, what type of employee is basically required in order to, make such a self-managing organization effective?
I think this is a rather interesting question. Like, do we ever ask ourselves, like, what kind of employee do we need to succeed in hierarchy and in bureaucracy? I think we can all, almost all of us can do that. Think about, we can all manage our private life. Many of the people I think that are watching this stream can buy a house or have a family or stuff like that. There is just a very small percent of people, I think, that cannot handle certain responsibility or accountability. So I think that might be more of the question. Like, you have to ask people, do you want to work in such an environment? Do you want to have peer control? Do you want to decide about certain big decisions that you have to also bear the consequences if it goes wrong? I think many people can do that, but many people are not necessarily used to that nowadays in their job. And what we see in the transformations that happen from like a very traditional organization to one that is more self-managed, most of the time you see there is people leaving the organization. By the way, these transformations, they don't go overnight, right? So they take like 1 or 2, maybe 3 years before they are somehow done. And over those years, you will see at least 10 to 20% of the people leaving the organization for a diverse set of reasons. Some people, they just don't like that kind of a responsibility, but also other people cannot get rid of the idea that they want to have power. They want to tell other people what to do. So those people most of the time leave to other pyramids where they can again find their position in the hierarchy.
Yeah, I think I agree, but that's also, I think, one of my earlier remarks. It's not for everybody. I mean, I think you mentioned it, Joost, that some people, also they cannot handle really the responsibility that much because they're not used to it. And at once they have their own budget and have to make their own decisions. And for them, it can actually be a stressful event to move to self-organization. And as yet, I've not yet seen evidence that really things like stress and burnout are really lower in these self-organization environments than in hierarchical organizations. Because hierarchical organizations also have something safe. And if there's a problem, you go to your boss. If you don't like your colleague, you go to your boss. In a self-organization, you have to tell your colleague what your colleague does wrong. I know even one organization where colleagues have to fire each other if things go wrong. That's not something that everybody likes to do. You know, in principle, everybody could do it, but it's not something that everybody likes to do. I also find that for a number of these organizations are really very focused if they hire new people, you know, do you fit in our organization? Of course, the Netflix model is probably the most famous one. The selection process is very tough. I also worked with a consultancy that has really a self-organizing model. But I think, they really, before you get hired there, you have to go through so many hurdles to make sure that you have the right mindset to fit in. That's very important to them, but at the same time, that also limits them in their growth because they're so specific for the type of people that they want to hire that, you know, there's a maximum probably of 200 people in the Netherlands and that's it. And then the question is, are you happy with that? You know, there's no problem. If you're happy with 200, then by all means. Huh? But for them, that's a feeling because they think they can even do more, but then they have to bring in the wrong people. So I think there's a lot of emphasis on hiring people with that right mindset who are able to do it.
Maybe let's now switch from the employee level to maybe the leadership level, because I'm wondering, you know, these self-managing organizations, do they emerge as, let's say, the result of a top-down process? Let's say you have one, I don't know, the CEO has a certain, or the owner of the company has a certain vision and wants to implement the self-managing organization, or are we talking about bottom-up processes? What, you know, why do organizations actually transform?
Yeah, I think there are two questions. Oh, go ahead, Joost.
Okay, my more strict definition, I don't know any I don't know of any organization where they transformed not from the, like, where the initiative didn't come necessarily from, like, where it didn't come from a leadership position, not necessarily like the CEO or like the board of directors, but always always somebody with a leadership position that was able to at least create some kind of a movement around it. There is this famous case of bol.com in the Netherlands where they did like an Holacracy bottom-up transformation, but I think this is extremely rare. I haven't seen that, or I haven't heard many other stories like that. Not yet. Maybe it happens after this webinar, but the top leadership is also in the bol.com case, by the way. The top leadership knew about this transformation and they didn't block it. I think as soon as you have a leadership that blocks this kind of transformation, it will just never happen. Like I think it will never happen. It will be just too difficult, and the people that are want to do this kind of transformations eventually will just move on to another organization or start their own organizations from this kind of different kind of set of principles. And I think many of the organizations I talk of originate from that belief. So they either start their own organization or they came in as a CEO and the leader transformed the organization. Like Handelsbanken in Sweden is an interesting case that transformed in the 70s, I think. Yeah. And has been like relatively, I think 3 layers of hierarchy only for a bank is quite unusual, at least.
Yeah, I think it's a bit counterintuitive that top management should be involved in implementing self-organization. I sometimes hear say, but I've also rarely seen it differently. I know I've seen 2 other cases in large multinationals where, let's say, middle management tried to do it for their own business unit. And that worked for a while, but that business unit manager, he had to put in a lot of effort to keep the rest of the organization at a distance and explain what he was doing in his business unit. And since there was no real support for for that. In the rest of the organization, you saw the initiative really stopped as soon as that manager left. So sometimes in a part organization, a manager may be able to do it within his own unit or department or something like that. But if it isn't endorsed at one time or another by somebody more senior in the hierarchy, I think it will be very difficult to do it.
So it means if there are few rebels within an organization, it's difficult to actually, or if these rebels leave the organization, it's difficult to have a sustainable self-managing organization. So some of the questions here also, well, yeah, and that's a little bit my point. You know, I'm a simple-minded, bit more strategic management scholar who asked the question about what about performance, or first maybe the question like how sustainable is this self-managing organization? So because I heard of some cases where actually the companies, well, first initiated self-managing organization and then turned back to the classical managerial hierarchy. And the second question is indeed, let's say, what about, can we say anything about the survival or the performance of these organizations, or do we need different criteria to measure the success of self-managing organizations than of normal managerially organized organizations?
Well, I think maybe the academic answer is we don't know, because it's far too soon to tell. If you look at a traditional hierarchical model of the business unit that started in 1923, and only 30 years later, we had enough data to do some research that actually showed that their return on investment was higher than other models. And then we're only looking at return on investment. So we just don't have enough examples. We do see organizations that turn back the clock, so to say, but we've also seen organizations that have been doing this for quite a while. I think the more interesting point at the moment is not whether it's possible in principle. I think we have a proof of principle that this can work and that this can be sustainable. I think it's more also at what level and at what scale can we do it. And it's interesting what Joost said, that he looks at the very big companies that do it. Is this going to stay limited to just that specific group? Or can we imagine that even more and other organizations are going to do this as well? So I think that's probably a more challenging question, to what extent you can scale it. But I think some of them that have done it have shown very good results. And for others, it may be different. We live in a time of experimentation, and only 10 or 20 years from now, we can really tell what worked.
Yeah, but I agree with many things, what you say, but I think there are some things we can at least compare, like these organizations with peers in their industry. And if we compare, for example, Buurtzorg with their peers in the Dutch healthcare organization, we do definitely see that they are more successful on some like hard metrics like productivity and like profit. They don't really make a profit, but how they are efficient with like their resources. Their client satisfaction is higher, employee satisfaction is higher. There are quite some studies being done on that. I think there have been quite a lot of studies comparing Handelsbank as a bank with other banks in the West, at least in Western Europe, where they show that Handelsbank has been for years already not the most profitable bank, but most safe bank of all. So I think that's I think a good thing for a bank. There are some organizations doing this for many years already, like think about W.L. Gore, which ironically is turning back to more hierarchy at the moment, but also Morningstar in America, which is like a tomato processor. But these are, I would say, the poster boys of self-organizations that you hear all the time. There is also quite a bit that we visited actually, and we found that there was not much self-organization left anymore. If you would go to like Oticon, for example, in Denmark, has completely reverted back to hierarchy. Favi, which is a case study in La Louse book, which becomes quite famous at the moment, or a few years ago, they turned back to hierarchy a couple of years ago already. if you would go to Semco, Ricardo Semler in Holland, many people will know him. If you go to, we went to Brazil to Semco, there's maybe 50 people still working there. Like there's not much left of the large-scale self-organizing that they pioneered in maybe the 80s or 90s. So it's a very, it's an interesting question. If they have to be durable and if they have to be more profitable, what I regard more of a success is that the people that work there seems to be more engaged with what they are doing. They seem to be more happy with the work they are doing, and they're less frustrated by hierarchy and bureaucracy. But this is obviously a very biased view for my part, but that makes me happy at least to see that some organization pioneering at least some kind of alternative models to what we are used to already for 100 or 200 years.
But why did these organizations that started with self-managing organizations, why did they, as Ard-Pieter said, turn back the clock? Is there like common reasons, or also maybe what can we observe something like an effect of the current COVID crisis on self-managing organizations?
I think that's a bit too fast, but I think there has in the history there always has been this kind of appetite between like decentralization and centralization. I think this is also tied to technology, what technology is available and what is not. But I think the biggest stories I know, but these are just stories from just individual companies, is that either a leadership left or ownership was changed from, think about, for example, Zappos in the States that has been bought by Amazon. I think it's a question of time before the Amazon culture will go into this company. Similar thing can be said for bol.com and Ahold Delhaize. Maybe that corporate culture will creep into bol.com, or maybe bol.com's more startup culture will creep in Ahold Delhaize. We don't know. We might see that. But often it's the culture of the big firm taking over the culture of the startup. So this is one reason. The other reason is indeed a crisis, a financial crisis, or not necessarily the crisis itself, but the possibility of that there will be a crisis. So then there will be more control implemented by top leadership, and this control is often then not accepted by people that have always enjoyed high levels of autonomy. So then you will see the good people leaving the organization, or that is what the stories we hear, like top management is put in control. So that's kind of that kiss to this kind of self-organizing organizations. When you start with putting more top-down control or some kind of like unusual or usual hierarchy bureaucracy mechanisms, many people that are used to autonomy will then leave, or will be at least unhappy, and then the performance drops. Often then the top management decides to even put more control, and then performance drops even further, and then you're entering some kind of a death spiral of self-organization. In the end, you end up with like a traditional organization again, which I don't say that is necessarily bad. I think you can run an organization very successfully with hierarchy and bureaucracy. I think there's many examples in the world showing that you can be very profitable and you can be very efficient if you are using a hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think CEO change is also sometimes an important one, because I think some of the CEOs that started this were also very high profile. They knew how to do it. It was also part of maybe their star status as a CEO. And I find that some of these people also do not really take care of their succession very well, because they play the humble role, but in reality, they're not really humble. And then when somebody else comes along, the system just isn't established enough on the C level and in the success and among the successors to continue it. I know certainly in the Netherlands 2 or 3 examples where I think that happened.
And I think obviously scale is another one. If companies scale rapidly, for example, or they do some interesting stuff on like the small to medium size, but once they scale, they just like get rid of those interesting mechanisms because they kind of think or advise to be more traditional, and so they just copy paste what other companies are doing.
Yeah. investors and the stock market sometimes demand it as well. Eh?
Oh yeah, that's another thing. That regulations might also cause this kind of things.
Yeah.
So my last block of questions is referring to the implementation of self-organization. So maybe there are now some rebels here in this webinar actually may want to implement changes in their organization and maybe see the advantages or the promise of the self-managing organization. So one of the questions is, if an organization actually thinks about implementing or moving to a organizing, should they rather use like standard frameworks like Holacracy? Is it more like, should it be more tailor-made, or how would you actually, or how do organizations actually do this?
You get right into my irritation zone with that question. Because I don't like the standard frameworks, in the sense that I say, look at the standard frameworks and get inspired by them, because there's lots of interesting things. For example, how decision making is done in Holacracy is really interesting. And I think a lot of companies can actually apply that. But there just is not one best way of organizing. There's not an optimal way of organizing. And also organizations that have adopted Holacracy according to the books, so to say, which is a very strict set of procedures. They tend to adapt it, or even after a while they start adapting it to what really fits their specific situation. So I think it's important to look around. In the sense, I like what ING had done, because they, like you, Joost, they went on a trip around the world and started looking at all kinds of organizations, seeing, what are interesting things and what can we learn from them. And they took a bit of Spotify and a bit of Google and a bit of Netflix. And then there were certain requirements here in the Netherlands from the Financial Markets Authority. And they put that in the mixer and came up with something that worked for them. And I think that is important to do. But in order to do that, you need to learn what all these organizations are doing. But you also need to make a very careful analysis of your own business and your own organization to see how you need to adapt those models to your specific requirements. So I think taking frameworks that are lying on the shelf and just applying them to your organization is more a recipe for disaster. Keep thinking and keep adapting it to your own people, your own market, your own processes, your own product.
I think you're a bit harsh on the frameworks. Like I have seen some companies actually, and you're right in your book about the company, for example, Vrije in Amsterdam, that uses Holacracy.
Yeah, but they didn't adopt the constitution. Eh?
I don't know, but they move beyond the Holacracy model, and I think the Holacracy. I don't want to go too deep in this model because I'm not completely familiar with it, but I can I do understand that a model can be quite a good enabler to get rid of the old and start something new. And then I think indeed you need to build your own model from maybe adapt your own model from that existing model. And Holacracy is nothing new. It's already based on other models that were already in the world for a long time. I think Holacracy has only kind of commercialized it, or at least the company that owns the IP. I agree with Arton that any company that has interest in going in this direction, they should ask themselves, first of all, why do they want to go in this direction? If it's just purely, for example, for profit, for making more profit or being more efficient, then I'm not sure if that's the good motivator. I think the motivator must be much more based on the needs of the frontline employees and the enablers of new technologies for making better products or services for customers, or enable employees to do their job better. And then indeed what Art says, there's many different models. So there's just not one model, but there's all these kind of companies most of them have really started from scratch and have like built their model for many years. So you should get familiar with all of them, and you should understand why some models work and why others work, and what are the mechanisms and processes behind that. And what I very much like is not only to go on with your top management team to those companies, where actually select a group of people in your organization that are very enthusiastic about these new ways of working, that need to pioneer it, and let them go there to those companies without outside consultants, and let them asking questions directly to the people working in these organizations, and let them ask questions like, how does this work, and what is good about this way of working, and what is maybe less nice about this way of working, and then come up with a kind of a future design of how your organization could look like, and let a dedicated group of your organization pioneer this model inside your own organization and see what works and what kind of IT you would need and what not. And I think only if you build slowly your own model and you adapt it with your own people that are very motivated to do so, I think you will be successful. Just copy pasting a model that somebody else uses to be successful is never going to work. And I think we have seen that in Holland now a couple of times in healthcare organizations that just adopt the buurtzorg. I think ideas behind it, but not really the philosophy that comes with it. So they copy the processes and the mechanisms maybe, but not the philosophy and mindset, which I think again is a recipe for disaster. And you will see that many of these organizations turn back in 1 or 2 years back to their old state.
So it means that organizations need to be prepared that there's some kind of a learning process involved in the implementation. As you mentioned, like, see, we start with a first approach. We see what works. We see where do we observe problems. How can we solve these problems by adapting the self-managing organization to our specific circumstances in order to increase the to make it work better at this point. My last point is about, and that's also one of the questions in the chat, about the role of IT in self-managing organization. I think Joost, you just mentioned IT, and basically what IT is available, how do we how can we adapt the IT to the specific requirements of self-managing organizations. What is your experience with IT, especially in that implementation, and also not just in the implementation process, but later on also when the self-managing organization is running?
Yeah, it's, let's try to talk about it in a rather simplistic way. But like a middle management traditionally is there for a reason. It's not there just because it is not doing anything, right? So it has certain roles and it has certain functions, mostly done in, like, think about things like coordination, communication, some other kind of collaboration kind of mechanisms. They are taken care of by managers, or like control, or like that kind of things, or performance management. So if you imagine a big pyramid and you cut it in 1,000 pieces, you have to connect these 1,000 pieces again with each other. If there's like all self-managing autonomous units, then you need to, normally you connect that by like formal middle managers. So you have to connect all these pieces together. And this technology that needs to be able to do the roles that normally traditionally the middle manager was doing. So if we would go into buurtzorg, or you would go in Hire or Vuxville, you would see very much sophisticated IT solutions to do all these kind of roles of coordination, of collaboration, of performance management, for example, of communication. If you will go to Hire, you will see the same. You will see like blockchain-enabled contracts between different teams that enable high levels of transparency, so everybody knows what's going on and everybody can find information as soon as possible. So yeah, there is this technology, especially digital technology, is very important, and it's often made from scratch. So there is not an off-the-shelf digital technology solution you can use, like, because it's so specific for your own situation. And I know, for example, from buurtzorg, I do quite a lot of work with buurtzorg, and I'm quite informed. They try to take their IT and like kind of they try to move that to Australia or America and implement there in healthcare organizations, but that doesn't work because it's so much context driven. And I think that is basically the situation for any organization. As soon as you're large, you need your own technology to enable this kind of coordination and communication function.
Yeah, and then it's even, I think, easier for new organizations, but if you're an existing organization, often your IT systems are spaghetti and everything's tied to each other, and that makes it very difficult, of course, to get the right information at the right place at the right time. So that's also a big implementation issue.
Yeah.
So cleaning up the IT is really necessary to make that work.
Yeah, and I think there's an existing that's a very important point. There's like in many traditional companies, there's an existing legacy of old IT systems, and people are not necessarily motivated to use IT solutions to communicate with others. So. Or to collaborate with others or to search for information. So it's also a matter of mindset for the people working in this organization to start using actually technology to do their job better. But this might be like a discussion for another webinar.
Yeah, great point. So basically we are now at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much, Ard-Pieter. Thank you very much, Joost, for sharing your views on self-managing organizations. Also, thank you very much to the audience for all the questions you asked. I hope that that we answered most of the questions. Unfortunately, we can't answer all the questions. So thank you very much. Have a nice week, and I hope to see you in the second webinar on October 27 on employee motivation and whether purpose or purse is actually the driver of employee motivation. Have a nice evening. Thanks again to our experts, and thank you also to the audience. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.